The Specter of Communism in Hawaii, 1947 to 1953. Chapter 13, The Hawaii Seven. On August 28, 1951, at 6:30 a.m., 21 FBI agents moved simultaneously to arrest 7 alleged leaders of the Communist Party in Hawaii. Those arrested included Jack Hall, regional director of the ILWU, John Rianecki, former teacher, Jack Komodo, employee of the Honolulu Record, Koji Ariyoshi, editor of the Honolulu Record, Jim Freeman, variably and irregularly employed, Charles Fujimoto, announced chairman of the Communist Party in Hawaii, and Eileen Fujimoto, wife of Charles Fujimoto and secretary to Jack Hall. The arrested soon came to be known as the Hawaii Seven. The indictment of the 7 charged that they had violated Section 2 of the Smith Act by conspiring, 1 unlawfully, willfully, and knowingly to advocate and teach the duty and necessity of overthrowing the government of the United States by force and violence, and 2 unlawfully, willfully, and knowingly to organize and help organize as the Communist Party of the United States of America a society, group, and assembly of persons who teach and advocate the overthrow and destruction of the government of the United States by force and violence. Footnote: United States v. Fujimoto et al. Criminal number 10495, page 81, cited hereinafter as the Smith Act transcript. The complete text of the indictment can be found at the conclusion of this work as Appendix L. The series of events connected with the Smith Act trial in Hawaii, from the arrest on August 28, 1951, to conviction on June 19, 1953, involved a great number of legal questions and generated an incredible amount of recorded legal material. The transcript of the trial alone runs in excess of 16,000 pages. On top of that, there were a number of legal issues that found their way into the courts both before and during the trial. The matter of setting bail was a significant legal issue. The prosecution demanded that Judge Delbert Metzger, the original judge on the case, disqualify himself. When a change in the court calendar placed J. Frank McLaughlin in charge of the case, the defense demanded that he disqualify himself. There was even the spectacle of watching Judge Metzger and Judge McLaughlin do battle with one another over the legality of the grand jury which brought the original indictment against the Hawaii Seven. At one point, Judge Metzger, who was chief judge, dismissed the grand jury only to have Judge McLaughlin, who was in charge of the criminal calendar, call them back into session. There were challenges to the substantive legality of the indictment as well as to the makeup of the grand jury. There were issues involving the case heard in San Francisco as well as in Honolulu. All of these matters, and many more, are worthy of scholarly treatment. But a full account of the Smith Act case in Hawaii is beyond the scope of this work. It is the logical sequel to this work. In this chapter, the author will select highlights from the 22-month ordeal known as the Smith Act case to establish the historical context of the episode and to describe the most important consequences of the experience for the territory of Hawaii. Footnote end. The Hawaii Seven were not necessarily chosen as the most dangerous members of the Communist Party in Hawaii, but as the ones whose activities between April 1, 1945, and the date of arrest, the chronological limits of the alleged conspiracy, were in violation of the Smith Act as recently construed by the United States Supreme Court in Dennis v. United States. The indictment included 11 overt acts committed by as few as 1 and as many as 7 of the defendants. These acts included everything from attending Communist Party conventions and serving on the executive board of the Communist Party in Hawaii, to Charles Fujimoto's announcement that he was the chairman of the Communist Party in Hawaii, Koji Ariyoshi's publishing the Honolulu Record, and Jack Hall's having instructed a person. The indictment did not say how who he believed would be subpoenaed by a committee of the Congress of the United States. There was one overt act listed which read in full as follows: on or about January 12, 1949, Jack Wayne Hall, a defendant herein, did travel from the city and county of Honolulu, territory of Hawaii, to the city of San Francisco. Conspiracy law has a special quality in that all members of the conspiracy are held responsible for the acts and words of other members of the conspiracy. An interesting aspect of the indictment of the Hawaii Seven is that they were all made part of a larger conspiracy by the technique of listing 13 co-conspirators who were not defendants herein. These unindicted co-conspirators included all 11 of the Communist Party leaders who had been convicted of violating the Smith Act in the Dennis case. William Z. Foster, the chairman of the Communist Party in the United States who had been dropped from the Dennis case due to ill health, and William Schneiderman, who had just been indicted on a Smith Act violation in California. If that were not enough, the indictment also charged that the conspiracy included diverse other persons to the grand jury unknown. Footnote: Smith Act transcript, page 81. During the trial, the words and acts of many individuals were introduced by the prosecution with the explanation that the individual so introduced was an unnamed co-conspirator. Footnote end. As soon as the Hawaii Seven had been rounded up, there came an immediate cry from within the ranks of the ILWU that the whole thing was nothing more or less than an effort to get Jack Hall and to bust the ILWU. The ILWU was in the final stages of sugar negotiations, successfully completed on September 2, 1951, with such cooperation on the part of the government that Jack Hall was allowed to hold one union meeting in the U.S. Marshal's office, and many feared that the arrest of Jack Hall would jeopardize the talks. The facts of the situation do not seem to support the ILWU's contention that the Smith Act trial in Hawaii was all part of a Big Five plot to bust the Union, though there were obviously some who saw the possible disruption or destruction of the ILWU as a salutary byproduct of the Smith Act case. In fact, Hawaii was the fifth in a series of government actions against alleged Communist Party leaders throughout the country since the Dennis decision on June 4, 1951. Similar arrests had been made in New York, June 20, 1951, California, July 26, 1951, Baltimore, August 7, 1951, and Pittsburgh, August 17, 1951. In all, the Justice Department pursued 16 separate cases similar to the Hawaii Smith Act trial before the constitutional heir was let out of the Smith Act balloon by Yates v. United States on June 17, 1957. The Smith Act, properly known as the Alien Registration Act of 1940, ironically grew out of congressional efforts to have Harry Bridges deported from the United States. The conspiracy provision of the Smith Act, the portion under which the Hawaii Seven were charged, was the only portion of the bill which did not involve immigration matters. It was added to the bill just minutes before its passage, and there was no significant debate on it. Footnote: in the spring of 1938, the United States Circuit Court, 5th District, held that alien Joseph Strecker could not be deported for being a member of an organization which advocated the overthrow of the American government by force and violence unless he were a member of that organization at the time of his arrest. A year later, the Supreme Court upheld this decision in Kessler v. Strecker, 307 U.S. 22. After the Fifth Circuit Court's decision, the Department of Labor, which then had jurisdiction over immigration cases, was forced to postpone the deportation hearing scheduled to begin against Harry Bridges on April 25, 1938. On March 20, 1939, even before the Supreme Court had acted on the Strecker case, Representative Howard Smith, Democratic from Virginia, introduced a bill which was intended to close the loophole which had prevented the deportation of Joseph Strecker and was making it necessary to amend the complaint against Harry Bridges. The Smith Act, as originally introduced, included a conspiracy section which made it illegal for citizens and aliens alike to teach and advocate the overthrow of the American government by force and violence. But essentially it was an immigration bill. 3 months after Smith's bill had been introduced, Representative John McCormack, Democratic from Massachusetts, introduced legislation to punish whoever knowingly or willfully advocates the overthrow of the government by force and violence. When the McCormack bill passed the House Judiciary Committee rewrote the conspiracy section of the Smith bill so as to eliminate the redundancy. During the debate on Smith's Alien Registration Act, the author of the bill was asked, "Will this bill as presently proposed give Congress authority to handle the Bridges case?" Smith's response was, "That is exactly what it was designed to do." In the closing moments before the Alien Registration Act was to be voted upon, Smith, fearing that the McCormack legislation would not pass the Senate, which it did not, restored the original conspiracy section to the bill, lest the reader assume that Smith did not fully realize the implications of this act. It should be understood that the Virginia congressman declared at the time he restored the conspiracy section that he regarded it as the very heart of the legislation. "We have laws against aliens who advocate the overthrow of this government by force, but do you know that there is nothing in the world to prevent a treasonable American citizen from doing so?" No action was taken by the Senate on the Smith Act for almost a year. While the bill was languishing in the Senate, on May 14, 1940, Representative A. Leonard Allen, Democratic from Louisiana, introduced a bill calling for the deportation of Harry Bridges, who had successfully fought the 1939 effort to deport him. The Allen bill was passed in the House of Representatives by a vote of 330 to 42 on June 14, 1940. 5 days later, Attorney General Robert H. Jackson sent a strongly worded memorandum to the Senate Committee on Immigration pointing out the bill's obvious constitutional disabilities and calling for its rejection by the Senate. By the spring of 1940, the events in Europe, particularly the Nazi-Soviet Non-Aggression Pact, had aroused the American people to threats of subversion. Senator Tom Connally, Democratic from Texas, indicated eagerness to secure legislation because it will have a very fine effect on the public mind and assure the public that Congress is doing something about the so-called fifth column and in correcting subversive activities. The Senate ducked the Alien Bill and passed the Smith Act, which was signed into law by President Franklin D. Roosevelt on June 28, 1940. When the Smith Act came out of conference committee and back to the House of Representatives, it was passed by a vote of 382 to no action was taken by the Senate on the Smith Act for almost a year. While the bill was languishing in the Senate, on May 14, 1940, Representative A. Leonard Allen, Democratic from Louisiana, introduced a bill calling for the deportation of Harry Bridges, who had successfully fought the 1939 effort to deport him. The Allen bill was passed in the House of Representatives by a vote of 330 to 42 on June 14, 1940. 5 days later, Attorney General Robert H. Jackson sent a strongly worded memorandum to the Senate Committee on Immigration pointing out the bill's obvious constitutional disabilities and calling for its rejection by the Senate. By the spring of 1940, the events in Europe, particularly the Nazi-Soviet Non-Aggression Pact, had aroused the American people to threats of subversion. Senator Tom Connally, Democratic from Texas, indicated eagerness to secure legislation because it will have a very fine effect on the public mind and assure the public that Congress is doing something about the so-called fifth column and in correcting subversive activities. Congressional Record, Senate, June 10, 1940, page 2818. The Senate ducked the Alien Bill and passed the Smith Act, which was signed into law by President Franklin D. Roosevelt on June 28, 1940. When the Smith Act came out of conference committee and back to the House of Representatives, it was passed by a vote of 382 to 4. Only the radical socialist from New York, Representative Vito Marcantonio, spoke against it. I believe this is the most incongruous proposition I have ever heard. On the one hand, you say that you want to preserve American liberty and then attempt to preserve American liberty by destroying American liberty. Congressional Record, House of Representatives, June 22, 1940, page 9034. Footnote end. The United States government had only once made use of the Teach and Advocate section of the Smith Act before July 20, 1948, when 12 leaders of the Communist Party were indicted in New York. Footnote. The prior use involved a friendless group of Trotskyites in Minneapolis during World War II. In a remarkable bit of irony, the Daily Worker, with its Stalinist viewpoint, praised the United States government for its decisive action in the case. The American people can find no objection to the destruction of the fifth column in this country. On the contrary, they must insist on it. Quoted from Walter Goodman, The Committee, page 99n. Footnote end. The New York trial of the top Communist Party leaders in the United States lasted from January 17 to October 14, 1949, when all 11 defendants were found guilty. On August 1, 1950, the United States Court of Appeals upheld the original decision, and on June 4, 1951, the Supreme Court, in Dennis v. United States, found the conspiracy section of the Smith Act to be constitutional. Justices Hugo Black and William O. Douglas dissenting. Chief Justice Fred M. Vinson wrote the majority decision, which involved a reinterpretation of the clear and present danger doctrine first enunciated by Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes, Jr., in Schenck v. United States in 1919. Vinson held that it was sufficient that the conspirators were willing to overthrow the government if and when possible. Further, he held that the probability of success in an attempt to overthrow the government was too hard a measure and, therefore, not a proper measure. An attempt to overthrow the government by force, even though doomed from the outset, Vinson wrote for the majority, is sufficient evil for Congress to prevent. Footnote. Dennis v. United States, 341 U.S. 494, 1951. In his dissent, Hugo Black wrote, public opinion being what it now is, few will protest the conviction of the communist petitioners. There is hope, however, that in calmer times, when the present passions and fears subside, this or some later court will restore the First Amendment liberties to the high preferred place where they belong in a free society. In contrast, United States Attorney General J. Howard McGrath said, "This is a good day for loyal citizens and a bad day for the conspirators. I am proud of those who worked so hard and faithfully to achieve the result." Footnote end. There is no doubt that from the date of the first conviction in the Dennis case until the Supreme Court's decision on the constitutionality of the Smith Act, the Department of Justice was preparing to move against the so-called second-string communists. In a 1975 interview, Howard K. Hoddick, acting U.S. attorney at the time of the Smith Act arrests in Hawaii, recalled for the author a meeting he had attended on the subject in Washington, D.C. At this meeting, which Hoddick recalled as having taken place shortly after the original lower court decision in the Dennis case, Attorney General J. Howard McGrath told the assembled U.S. attorneys of the Justice Department's plans to prosecute regional leaders of the Communist Party throughout the United States. He told those assembled that the FBI was, at that very time, preparing for such trials. I cannot assume, Haddock told the author, that the FBI's decision was influenced by any calls from the sugar factors or business interests in Hawaii. There were a variety of predictable reactions to the arrest of the Hawaii 7. The ILWU's reaction, mentioned above, was echoed by the Honolulu Record, whose editor was among those arrested. The Record quoted extensively from the dissenting opinions of Black and Douglas in the Dennis decision. Both left-wing and right-wing Democrats were quoted with hopeful comments that the Smith Act case might help to clear the air. The Honolulu Advertiser saw the arrests as part of a national battle against treason. The Honolulu Star-Bulletin saw the arrests as a clear warning to individuals or unions which accept, as leaders, men who follow the Moscow instead of the American line. The Hawaii Residents Association, IMUA, greeted news of the arrests with an announcement that they would expand their Pier 7 headquarters and increase their hours of operation. An open house was announced for September 6 to 8. It was during the period of the Smith Act arrests and trial that IMUA reached its peak of influence in the community. The popularity of Spotlight, the organization's newspaper, jumped dramatically with the addition of Tony Tadero as its featured columnist beginning on September 26, 1951. Tadero added a songwriter's touch to IMUA's anti-communist efforts. He had special names for friends and enemies alike. His two biggest friends were Minnie Stroni and Andy Pasta. In a 1975 interview with the author, Tadero, who has long since repudiated his IMUA days, told the author that Minnie and Andy were actually the local FBI agents. According to Tadero, the FBI allowed him to read their teletype dispatches from Washington, D.C. as they came off the machine. Tadero would then reveal his inside information through the mouths of his fictional spies, Minnie and Andy. Footnote: Interview with Tony Tadero, March 23, 1975. Tadero told the author that during the Smith Act trial, I made a complete turnabout on the question of whether Jack Hall was guilty. Tadero, who regularly attended the trial, continued, there was absolutely no proof that these people were enemies of the country. Tadero added that he came to see the right wing as a greater threat to the nation. After his anti-communist period, Tadero became very active in the civil rights movement. He told the author that his meeting Martin Luther King remains one of his most prized memories. Tadero also points with pride to the fact that, in 1972, he won an $8,000 settlement and a public retraction from David Waddimull, then owner of the now-defunct radio station KTRG. Waddimull had said on the air that someone told me that Tony Tadero is under the surveillance of the FBI. On top of that, KTRG announcer Jeff Burnside, who was also named in Tadero's suit, had said on the air that Tadero got his orders direct from Moscow. The quotes from Waddimull and Burnside are from Tony N. Tadero v. Hawaiian Paradise Park Corp. David Waddimull, et al., civil number 31187, footnote end. Tadero's enemies were less carefully disguised. There was Rattletrap McElrath, alias Robert M.C. Elmouse. Charles Fujimoto had such names as Charlie the Commie and Waterboy Charlie. Jack Hall was known as Angel Hall, but Tadero's favorite was Koji Ariyoshi, whom he called my boy Koji. Harriet Bauslag was referred to as the proletarian pin-up. The Smith Act defendants were known to Tadero as the Seven Mules of Moscow. There were times when Tadero could be genuinely funny, as when the government's special prosecutor, John C. Walsh, tipped over backward in his chair. But Tadero could also be brutally vicious. Tadero's column continued in the spotlight through the February 1953 edition. In March, the editors explained that Tadero's space was needed for letters, and in May, it was announced that Tadero's column had been received too late for publication. It was never mentioned again. Tadero did not publicly repudiate the position he had defended so staunchly for another 2 years, but he was through with IMUA. Footnote: in the Honolulu Advertiser, May 23, 1955, page 4, Tony Tadero responded to a letter from Paul Crouch, a professional ex-communist who had been a government witness in the Smith Act trial in Hawaii. Tadero said then that Crouch's letter attacking statehood for Hawaii compels me to dust off my soapbox abandoned 2 years ago after severing relations with IMUA. I cannot go along with Crouch that the communist menace in Hawaii is grave enough to warrant a denial of statehood. I strongly disagree with my good friend, Dr. Lyle Phillips, of IMUA, that nowhere in the mainland has the Communist Party progressed towards its evil aims as has the Communist Party in Hawaii. I challenge IMUA, Paul Crouch, and all prejudiced congressmen to submit to the public a list of names that could be elected to sit in Congress as Moscow agents and another list of political issues these Moscow agents would try to force upon the National Congress that would benefit Russia. I challenge these people, also, to pinpoint their charges that the legislature of Hawaii is dominated or influenced by communists or communist philosophy. Give us names and specific action and not a general charge that McElrath was seen talking to certain lawmakers at Iolani Palace. Footnote end. During the period between the arrest and trial of the Hawaii 7, there were a number of public exchanges which had the effect of ventilating the issues surrounding the case. The ILWU and IMUA provided a constant radio dialogue as well as some major, one-shot efforts. Two of these are worth special attention. First, an ILWU pamphlet called Fear and IMUA's The Answer to Fear by Urban E. Wild. Second, IMUA's special edition of IMUA Spotlight entitled The American Way of Life and the ILWU response to it, Americanism, as defined by Great Americans. Fear was actually a reprint, in pamphlet form, of a speech by Harriet Bauslag, one of the defense attorneys for the Hawaii 7. The speech was given at a 1951 Labor Day rally held by the ILWU just days after the arrest of the Hawaii 7 had taken place. Bauslag told the Union men that the reason for the prosecution of Jack Hall is the same as that for the prosecution of Harry Bridges, and that, she said, will continue until the government silences all who dare to challenge the right of government to freeze wages, while profits soar, who demand peace when the government is bent on war. There follows an indictment of the FBI, Harry Truman, Joe McCarthy, and the Supreme Court. Then, turning specifically to the Smith Act prosecutions being undertaken by the government, she asks, how does the government prove its point? Here is where the stool pigeon, the professional witness, the political opportunist, the renegade, the Izukas, the Kawanos come in. They announced that they were once communists, and that when they were communists, they were terrible people who engaged in all sorts of illegal activity, but now that they have seen the light, they would like to help the government put behind bars all their former associates whom they now hate. They are paid with publicity, with witness fees, with royalties from their books and pamphlets. One of these stool pigeon informers, Mr. Izuka, once testified that he directed a slowdown at Port Allen to hold up Lend-Lease ships. No Lend-Lease ship ever docked on Kauai, but no lie is too big for these stool pigeons or the government prosecutors. The ILWU attorney then turned to the question of the freedom of the press, pointing out the incongruity of the situation in which the Honolulu Record can be granted the privilege of using the mails by the same government which has charged that the production of that newspaper is an overt act in support of a conspiracy to teach and advocate the overthrow of the government of the United States. Discussing Charles Fujimoto and his avowed commitment to communism, Harriet Bauslag offered a truism frequently made by socialists under attack in the United States. Now, there is nothing in the United States Constitution that says capitalism and democracy are the same thing. Bauslag concluded her remarks with a warning to her audience. Do not feel safe because your name is not among the 7, because if this conspiracy of the government against the 7 succeeds, you and your children will have lost your liberties, and we will go again into dark ages of thought control against which we fought in Germany, in Japan, in Italy, and to which our government has now turned to maintain itself in power. On November 26, 1951, Honolulu attorney Urban E. Wild delivered a speech to the membership of IMUA which was a response to Harriet Bauslag. It was published as a small pamphlet with the title The Answer to Fear. It began with a recitation of the pertinent parts of the Smith Act. It then reviewed the Dennis case. Wild asserted that the prosecution in the Dennis case had proved 4 key points to be basic to the program of the Communist Party in the United States. 1. To teach those subject to their influence secretly to prepare for the coming of some crisis such as a deep depression or war with the Soviet Union. 2. To spring into action when the word of command was given upon the coming of such a crisis. 3. To paralyze powerhouses, transportation systems, vast industrial machinery in the heart of our economic organization. 4. In the resultant chaos and confusion to bring about by violence and unlawful means the overthrow or destruction of the government and the setting up of a dictatorship of the proletariat. Footnote, Urban E. Wild, The Answer to Fear, Honolulu, Hawaii Residents Association, 1957, page 3. Nothing so specific as that which Wild claimed had been proved in the Dennis case. Consider Chief Justice Vinson's treatment of the same basic ground which Wild was covering in his augmented version of the Dennis decision. The formation by petitioners of such a highly organized conspiracy, with rigidly disciplined members subject to call when the leaders, these petitioners, felt that the time had come for action, coupled with the inflammable nature of world conditions, similar uprisings in other countries, and the touch-and-go nature of our relations with countries with whom petitioners were in the least ideologically attuned, convince us that their convictions were justified. Dennis v. United States footnote end. Wild then turned to the contempt convictions sustained by all 5 defense attorneys in the Dennis case and by Eugene Dennis, who had defended himself in the original trial. Wilde quoted Judge Jerome Frank of the United States Court of Appeals, who had concurred in upholding the 6 contempt convictions. "We affirm," Judge Frank wrote, "for the plain reason that the crude antics of these lawyers, if copied in other cases, would almost surely disrupt trials." These words of a learned judge, Wilde said, certainly answer more eloquently than I could the propaganda that is the main theme of Harriet Bauslog's fear. It is not entirely clear what Wilde meant here, unless he was warning Harriet Bauslog to watch her step in the courtroom. Perhaps he anticipated the situation which did develop during the Smith Act trial in Hawaii, in which the trial judge, John Wade, asked the U.S. Attorney A. William Barlow to look into a speech Mrs. Bauslog had made at Honokaa, on the Big Island on December 14, 1952. Footnote: on that occasion, Mrs. Bauslog had told her audience that horrible and shocking things were going on in the trial of the Hawaii Seven. She asserted that it was impossible for them to get a fair trial, and was openly critical of the rules of evidence used by Judge Wade. Though nothing came of the possible contempt charge, after the Smith Act trial was over, a complaint was brought against Mrs. Bauslog to have her suspended from the practice of law for a period of 1 year. The Territorial Supreme Court did suspend her. The Court of Appeals upheld the decision, but the United States Supreme Court finally overturned the suspension. Henry Harriet Bauslog Sawyer, 3 liters. Ed. 2d 1473 on June 29, 1959. Footnote end. Whatever Wilde had in mind, he certainly did not think Mrs. Bauslog's Labor Day speech on Kauai was befitting an officer of the court. Wilde was even critical of Mrs. Bauslog's praise of the historic role of the ILWU in Hawaii, which was, he asserted, merely brought in to bring quick sympathy on generalities, and to provide a reason for reproduction and distribution of her Labor Day address, which of course was not on labor as such but was devoted to an attack on the Smith Act. IMUA, as an organization, was concerned not only about the fact that Harriet Bauslog's fear had been printed, but that it was being distributed in such a way that it might do great harm to the community. And so, with the approval of the Territorial Department of Public Instruction, IMUA produced a special edition of Spotlight, primarily for use in the schools, but also for sale to the general public. This special edition, called The American Way of Life, was a compilation of patriotic slogans and conservative social philosophy. One article, purporting to deal with the Bill of Rights, offered the following message: "We say that we want personal freedom, but we demand government housing, government price controls, government guaranteed jobs and wages. We boast that we are responsible persons, but we vote for candidates who promise us special privileges, government pensions, government subsidies, and government electricity. Such schemes are contrary to the spirit of the Bill of Rights." The special edition's treatment of labor emphasized that labor management cooperation was the way to prosperity. It was highly critical of those who assume labor and management to exist in an adversary relationship. And in a section which sought to describe what the term "sweet land of liberty" meant, it was stated that one of its meanings was the right to organize competitive labor unions. Tony Tadero wrote the longest article in the special edition, an apocalyptic description of the struggle between communism versus the American way of life, which he called the climactic struggle of human rights. Tadero first turned his pen to the matter of religion. Communism destroys religion. Can you imagine what this means to the hundreds of thousands of religious institutions in America which are benefiting the spiritual and economic welfare of millions of God-fearing Americans? This is the kind of life that William Z. Foster, Charles Fujimoto, and the rest of America's Stalinists are preparing for we unhappy Americans. Tadero dismissed the assertion of some that there was such a thing as a uniquely American variant of communism. The answer is simple, Tadero in tone: communists are liquidated if they fail to blow their noses whenever Joe Stalin sneezes. It must be remembered that actually there is no American party or movement. Tadero closed his column with a ringing pronouncement: communism without a violent revolution is like Christianity without Christ. The ILWU, angered by the American way of life, decided to publish its own view of America for Hawaii's school children. It was called Americanism, as defined by great Americans. The Territorial Department of Public Instruction denied the ILWU the right to distribute its pamphlet in the schools. In the foreword, the editor commented upon the situation: "In our judgment, IMUA presented only the reactionary businessman's concept. We felt that students had a right to know that Americanism is not that narrow and rigid, that Americanism, as defined by great Americans, is a strong, living, growing, beautiful expression of ever-increasing freedom for all people." The Department of Public Instruction has called the writings of the people quoted in this booklet: Franklin D. Roosevelt, Henry David Thoreau, Frederick Douglass, Thomas Jefferson, Abraham Lincoln, Oliver Wendell Holmes, Jr., Wendell Willkie and others, cleverly weave propaganda. They have censored these great Americans, and have declared that they will not allow distribution of this booklet through the schools as they allowed the partisan IMUA publication to be distributed. 28. The ILWU pamphlet was properly characterized as cleverly weaved propaganda, but it is doubtful that it should have been disqualified by the Department of Public Instruction unless that body was prepared to say that the IMUA pamphlet was acceptable because it was not cleverly weaved. A look at some of the quotations used in Americanism, as defined by great Americans, will offer the reader some idea of the flavor of the pamphlet. Thoreau was quoted on the law. The law will never make men free. It is men who have got to make the law free. Justice Holmes' plea for freedom for the thought we hate was there. 6. Willkie was similarly quoted. Whenever we take away the liberties of those whom we hate, we are opening the way to loss of liberty for those we love. Labor is the superior to capital, and deserves much the higher consideration. Lincoln was quoted as saying, 10. FDR was called upon many times. His speech about the economic royalists was cited as well as his statement, "The test of our progress is whether we provide enough for those who have too little." And so it went, concluding with selections from important international documents including the Atlantic Charter, the Preamble to the United Nations Charter, and the United Nations Universal Declaration of Rights. But there was more happening in this period than the running ideological battle between IMUA and the ILWU. One of the most dramatic events added considerable fuel to the ILWU's contention that the whole purpose of the Smith Act case was to get at Jack Hall and, through him, the Union. In late December 1951 and early January 1952, two FBI agents, Richard Burris and James Condon, met with the ILWU's educational director, David Thompson, in an attempt to get Jack Hall to repudiate communism in exchange for release from his indictment. Thompson had 3 meetings with Burris and Condon. The first one was on December 15th, the second on December 18th, and the third on January 9th. The latter 2 were at the home of David Thompson and were recorded in their entirety by Robert McElrath, who had concealed himself with recording equipment. The tapes do not reveal exactly what would have been expected of Jack Hall had a deal been made, but David Thompson has indicated on many occasions that one of the key points of the FBI agents in the December 15th meeting was that Jack Hall would have to pull Hawaii's ILWU unions out of Harry Bridges' International Union. Whether both sides saw the arrangement in the same light, we cannot say, but there is no doubt that there was an attempt to make a deal. In the December 18th meeting, one of the agents put it this way: "We couldn't say Jack, if you say so and so we'll get the indictment dismissed, or you won't have to go to trial, we'll back you to the hilt. What we could do would be to explain his position to the guy who regulates these indictments, who's going to press the thing and see if it couldn't be straightened out whereby it would be 6 instead of 7. In the interview on January 9, 1952, David Thompson reported to the FBI agents that Jack Hall had not been particularly receptive to the suggestion that he cooperate with the FBI. Thompson spoke. "I told him I told him, you know, I says, when those guys were up to see me they mentioned the fact that if you weren't a communist they wished you weren't in this deal and they wished there were 6 instead of 7. And Jack says you guys know darn well that he's not a communist, and that you're trying to get him to break the Union." 30. A few moments later, the following exchange took place. Agent: "Well, that's if Jack, as he indicated again as it seems to me, were really out of it and got out a while back, and has been fighting them and isn't an undercover for them. You see, that's the thing that always we have to watch out for. Just kinda telling you our abusiness a little bit, but you can see the person, in fact, that's undercover is possibly a greater danger to the country than one who is more open about it, and easier to keep tabs on. But we can't be naive about it, and not fully protect the security of the country and do the job that they give us to do. But I don't know, did you have a chance to read the paper tonight?" Thompson: "No, I just read the thing on Churchill." Agent: "Check page 14, first column." The article in question, which Thompson apparently checks as he sat there with the agents, concerns a possible defect in the original indictment, a situation which might make it necessary to re-indict the Hawaii 7 or 6. Thompson: "Yeah, well I kind of figured this might happen." Agent: "If what he says is true, then that's when we'd like to make it 6 instead of 7. Thompson: "Ernie Charen. Agent: "We're corning up to a logical place here that if it slips on beyond there'll be no turning back for anyone. 3 leaders. The FBI agents did not realize that a turning point, if there ever was one, had long since passed. On January 24, 1952, Robert McElrath went on the air with the FBI recordings. The revelation was met by the friends of the Hawaii 7 with great enthusiasm. It was not even mentioned in the Honolulu Advertiser or the Honolulu Star Bulletin. When FBI agent C.C. Weeks was asked about the recordings by the Honolulu Record, his response was a terse, "We don't comment on those things." During the Smith Act trial, attorney Richard Gladstein attempted to bring Richard Burris to the stand to be interrogated about the interviews he and Condon had with David Thompson, but the government's counsel objected, saying, "He is only called here to bring a red herring into this case. You are dealing with a conversation which is absolutely irrelevant to this case. It is an old trick, one often employed, trying the agent, trying the policeman, trying the sheriff, trying the state, rather than meeting the issues of this case." After much debate, Judge John Wigg agreed with the prosecution that Burris' testimony would not be relevant to the case, adding that if these things, meaning the attempt to make a deal with Jack Hall, were done in excess of their authority, it would not be binding on the government in any way. Thus, posterity was denied an FBI explanation of the incident. There can be no doubt, however, that the revelation of the Thompson FBI interviews provided the ILWU leadership with a welcome and unexpected weapon in its continuing effort to demonstrate that the Smith Act trial was another episode in the government's unending effort to bust the ILWU. Two more sections of the Thompson FBI interviews are especially interesting. The first comes from the December 18, 1951 interview. The agents had been telling Thompson that Hall's cooperation would be in the best interest of the ILWU. The second is even more revealing. It took place during the January 9, 1952 interview. They were discussing the possible danger the six facing trial along with Jack Hall posed to the security of the nation and the local community. David Thompson indicated that he did not see how anyone should lose a lot of sleep over the threat they represented. One of the agents responded, "You can't put these guys out here on any basis at all with the Communist Party leaders on the mainland who have been picked up and are under process of being tried under the Smith Act. They just don't rate. These would make poor communists in the lowest cell in California, but they're the guys who are the leaders of the Communist Party here, and so we're stuck with them." In the spring of 1952, a big flap was created when John Wayne came to Hawaii to make what was undoubtedly one of his worst films, Big Jim McLean. It was a story about a communist effort to seize control of the labor movement in Hawaii. In it, Art Ruttles played the part of an anti-communist labor leader. People clamored for bit parts in the film or for the chance to meet John Wayne, who played the part of a two-fisted, commie-fighting FBI agent. When Wayne left Hawaii, it was rumored that he had left IMUA $200 richer. Politics produced no real surprises in 1952. While Dwight D. Eisenhower was being elected President of the United States, Joseph R. Farrington was being returned to Washington, D.C., as Hawaii's delegate to Congress. In the Democratic primary to see who would run against Farrington, Judge Delbert Metzger defeated Superintendent of Public Instruction W. Harold Loper. This race was of interest because of Metzger's immense popularity in the ILWU and Loper's strong position with members of the Democratic Party's right wing. Metzger was remembered by the community for his decision in the contempt case of the Reluctant 39, for his reduction of bail for the Hawaii 7 from $75,000 to $5,000, and for his support of the contention of the Smith Act Defendants Council that Hawaii's federal grand jury was not representative of the community. Loper was remembered, primarily, for his role in the Reinecke case in 1948. Another old fixture in Hawaiian politics was returned to office as Mayor Johnny Wilson easily defeated his Republican opponent, Neil Blaisdell. Wilson had a tougher time in his own party primary, however, defeating Frank Fassi by a scant 3,000 votes. While the Honolulu Record found the 1952 primaries practically devoid of red baiting, it charged that Frank Fassi stood out among the few who labor baited. It was a relatively calm community which greeted the opening of Hawaii's Smith Act trial on November 5, 1952, the day after the general election. Footnote: the author will not attempt to summarize the Smith Act trial in Hawaii. To do so briefly would be to cover ground which has already been covered by Robert M. McNamara in a competent master's thesis on the subject. Robert M. McNamara, Hawaii's Smith Act Case Ma. Thesis No. 434. And to provide a full treatment of the trial would entail a work at least as long as the present one. In addition, there was little material covered in the Smith Act trial which dealt directly with communism in Hawaii which had not been revealed through the Reinecke hearing. The HUAC hearings and the Kawano testimony, material already covered earlier in this manuscript. The author will deal with those aspects of the Smith Act trial which demonstrate the character of the legal battle which confronted the Hawaii 7. Footnote end. The Smith Act trial in Hawaii, as elsewhere, was largely a literary exercise. The manner in which conspiracy was construed made it possible for the prosecution to have a witness merely mention the title of a book or pamphlet or periodical which could in any way, however remote, be connected with one of the defendants, one of the unindicted co-conspirators, or even one of the unnamed co-conspirators, to have the document entered as evidence and to have the defendants held responsible for its contents. Oddly, when defense counsel sought to introduce documents which would support the contention that their clients had not conspired to teach and advocate the overthrow of the American government by force and violence, even if they had been members of the Communist Party, which was never admitted, they found the court most reluctant to admit the material in question as evidence. In all, the prosecution presented 12 witnesses in making its case against the Hawaii 7. There were an additional 21 prosecution witnesses during the rebuttal phase of the case, but they did not participate in building the government's case against the defendants. Of those 12 witnesses, one, Honolulu Star-Bulletin writer A.S. Spicer, was on the stand for a matter of minutes only, describing the press conference in 1948 at which Charles Fujimoto had announced that he was the chairman of the Communist Party in Hawaii. Of the remaining 11, 8 were residents of the territory of Hawaii. The first local resident was Ernest L. Golden, who testified that he had been a member of the Communist Party briefly in 1946. He named the members of his group, none of whom were among the defendants, raising an objection from defense attorney A. L. Weirin. In a phrase which was to become quite common, government counsel Rex McKittrick said, "We are attempting to show a pattern, and certain individuals named by the witness will appear later as unnamed co-conspirators." The next local witness was Akiro Izuka, whose story is already well known to the reader. His testimony in the Smith Act trial added nothing significant. The same is true of the third and fourth local witnesses, Emil Muller and Henry Johnson, Jr., both of whom had testified before HUAC. Golden, Izuka, Muller, and Johnson all appeared in sequence between November 24 and December 12, 1952. The last 4 local witnesses appeared between January 22 and February 25, 1953, at the conclusion of the government's case. The first of the concluding witnesses was Robert M. Kemp, whose position as literary director of the Communist Party in Hawaii gave the prosecution a splendid opportunity to read a considerable amount of communist literature into the record, including extensive passages on the Russian Revolution. Kemp's direct examination produced no surprises except for the fact that it is surprising that, for one who had been so active in the Communist Party in Hawaii from 1946 to 52, his name had not come up before. Much of Kemp's cross-examination involved testifying about the pressure which had been put on him by FBI agents Burris and Condon. Kemp indicated that he had resisted at first, but after losing his Navy Yard pass in August 1952, he had begun to reconsider, finally agreeing to appear as a witness about 2 weeks ago. 40. Near the end of his cross-examination, when defense counsel Richard Gladstein was discussing with Kemp the tightening of security measures by the Communist Party in Hawaii in 1950, the following exchange took place. Gladstein, now, the purpose of that was to enable the party to continue to do the kind of work and activity that it had been in the past. Isn't that true? Kemp, yes, to continue the operation of the party at all costs, to work for the party's ultimate aims that were to overthrow the government and establish socialism. Gladstein, who suggested that you say that? Kemp, no one, it just came to my mind. 4 leaders. After Kemp came Henry Toyama, whose testimony left little doubt that he had, indeed, been a member of the Communist Party and had been in contact with a significant number of the defendants in that capacity. He offered no new information, only variations on what had already been said. As with Kemp, it was brought out in cross-examination that Toyama had been under considerable pressure from the FBI to testify. After establishing that Toyama had signed at least 2 loyalty oaths in which he had perjured himself, Richard Gladstein asked him, "Gladstein, isn't it true, Mr. Toyama, that by testifying here you expect that you will not be prosecuted for those false oaths that you gave back in 1950? Am I right about that?" Toyama, well, that is a reasonable assumption, but I am not banking on it. The next witness was Florence Tam, a young lady from Maui who had met the Reinekis during their tour of the outer islands in 1948. Miss Tam testified that John Reinecki had given her a copy of the Constitution of the Communist Party with the instructions that she should read it with discrimination. The prosecution also sought to introduce a portion of a letter John Reinecki had written to Miss Tam suggesting that she read certain communist literature. The counsel for defense insisted that the whole letter be read, and when this was done it was disclosed that Dr. Reinecki's list of books for Miss Tam included books which were critical as well as those which were favorable to communism. The final prosecution witness was Jack Kawano. Kawano's testimony was particularly significant in the Smith Act trial because it was the first time the former ILWU leader had been subjected to cross-examination. Kawano's cross-examination alone lasted for the better part of 8 days and required 861 pages of transcript for its reproduction. On direct examination, Kawano's testimony was a composite of his July 1951 HUAC testimony and the February 1952 Saturday Evening Post article, less the sighing trade winds, the swaying palm trees, and the scudding clouds, but with some augmentations. One Kawano story is particularly interesting. It concerned a trip to the Communist Party headquarters in New York in 1947. For some reason, this was not mentioned in Kawano's HUAC testimony. The Saturday Evening Post article had offered a brief account of the event. While I am at the Boston Convention, Kawano said, it is suggested by someone that I drop in the national offices of the Communist Party on my way home. And at the party office I talk with Betty Gannett and Eugene Dennis, the secretary of the party, and then Gannett brings in an old guy. His job, she says, is getting information. This old guy is kind of a father type, not too clean shave, and he talks very slow. He wants to know all about Pearl Harbor, Schofield Barracks, and how much military activity goes on. He wants to know how much war materials are sent to Far East and what contact system we have with communists in Japan and China. Most of all, he wants to know about defense operations. I tell him I don't know about such things. Then I wonder, do they want me to be a spy or something, and I don't feel so good about it. 3. When Kawano told the same story in the Smith Act trial, it went considerably beyond its brief mention in the Saturday Evening Post. The old guy was identified as Emmanuel Levine, a security officer with the Communist Party's national office. Hop, as Kawano indicated Levine was known, had asked about one of his old friends, Jack Komodo. Kawano explained that Levine and Komodo had been friends in the Communist Party in Los Angeles before World War II. On direct examination, Kawano said he had told Komodo about the meeting in a rather vague way. I told him that I met one of his old friends, and he said, well, who was he? And I told him that I do not recollect the name. And he said, well, what kind of guy was he? So I told him that he was kind of old, that he stated that he worked with you in Los Angeles, and that he also asked me whether we have established a liaison between the Communist Party in Japan, China, and the Philippines with Hawaii. And I told him that he told me to say hello to you, and he thought about it for a while, and he said, well, maybe I know who you mean. But he did not tell me exactly whether he knew that guy, or he did not try to repeat his name or anything like that. 44. When asked directly by counsel for the prosecution whether this was the extent of his conversation with Komodo about Pop Levine, Kawano replied, right. During cross-examination, Richard Gladstein pressed Kawano on the Pop Levine story. Gladstein, now this conversation, this part of the conversation about munitions, the shipments, the installations, the military personnel, you never told Mr. Komodo or Ariyoshi or Charles Fujimoto or Eileen Fujimoto or Jim Freeman or Jack Hall or John Rienecki, did you? Kawano, I did not. Gladstein, and the first time you gave any public exposition of it was in the Saturday Evening Post article. Kawano, right. 46. Kawano was also questioned about those who had encouraged him to go to Washington, D.C., to testify before HUAC. As before, Kawano named Chuck Mao, Mitsuyuki Kaido, Dr. Ernest Murai, and Daniel Inouye as being principally responsible. Saki Takahashi and Ernest Heen were mentioned as having taken lesser roles in his decision. John Burns and David Bentz, whom Kawano had mentioned when he testified before HUAC, were not mentioned during the Smith Act trial. After establishing some of the personnel involved, Gladstein drove to his point. Gladstein, isn't it a fact that during the time these people were constantly working on you to clear yourself, Mr. Kawano, they offered you money to set yourself up in business? Kawano, absolutely not. Gladstein, isn't it a fact that you did receive loans from them to set you up in business? Kawano, correct. I will read off to you the individuals whom I borrowed the money from. First, Mr. Kaido, I borrowed $2,750. From Mr. Murai, I borrowed $1,700. From Mr. Zero, I borrowed $2,000. From my brother, I borrowed $1,000. And from the Capital Investment Company, I borrowed $1,000. Gladstein, did you give notes for this money? Kawano, yes. Gladstein, were any of them secured? Kawano, yes, by Mr. Mao. Gladstein, all the notes. Kawano, all the notes except the $1,000 I borrowed from my brother. Gladstein, were they gifts or loans? Kawano, they were loans, as you can well see, as you can see for yourself. Gladstein, did you pay any part of them back? Kawano, not yet. Gladstein, when did you make them? Kawano, sometime in the latter part of 1951. Gladstein, about a year and 1/2 ago. Kawano, approximately, yes. Gladstein, as a matter of fact, some of these notes have a little trick clause in there that says that you wouldn't ever have to pay them at all unless you are able to and willing to do it. Isn't that right? Kawano, the understanding was that, as I made profits by operating that store, I was to pay back any portion of the loan that I have borrowed from time to time. However, while operating the business, if I happened to go broke and became penniless again, then those few individuals who loaned me the money, particularly Mr. Kaido, Mr. Zero, and Mr. Murai, they stated that in the event that I go broke and go penniless, forget about it. But if I make the money, if I prosper, they expect me to pay back. Obviously, the defense was seeking to establish that Jack Kawano had, in some way, been bought off by those who were using him to demonstrate their loyalty. While the purpose is difficult to ascribe with absolute certainty, there is no doubt that Jack Kawano had financed his liquor store in a very irregular manner. Footnote: ultimately, Kawano's business failed. The author has been unable to ascertain whether any of the loans were repaid. In the author's March 22, 1975 interview with Howard K. Hodde, the former acting U.S. attorney said that one of the government's special deputy prosecutors, Rex McKittrick, helped Kawano obtain a job in Southern California after the Smith Act trial had ended. Footnote end. Not only was the financing of Jack Kawano's liquor business unusual, but the manner in which he obtained his license to do business was equally irregular. Richard Gladstein brought evidence into court from the Liquor Commission to show that Jack Kawano's liquor store was in an area designated as Zone 17. Between July 1, 1945, and September 28, 1951, 5 applications had been made in Zone 17 for liquor permits by responsible individuals in the grocery and meat business, all of which were denied. Gladstein further asserted that Kawano was granted his liquor license after a closed hearing, such hearings normally being public. On these matters, Gladstein made the following observation: "We submit that the jury would be entitled to draw the inference that Mr. Kawano was the recipient of a very special and unusual, I will not say illegal, unusual and favorable benefit and advantage, and that, too, was a part of the entire consideration that was exchanged for his testimony." 49. In his cross-examination of Jack Kawano, Richard Gladstein made a strong effort to show that Kawano had become derelict in his union duties in the last 2 years of his membership in the ILWU. Gladstein, isn't it a fact that ever since 1947, your own local union had to beg you to come to union meetings and take care of their grievances for them? Isn't that true? Kawano, if that was true, how come I was elected as an officer the following year? Gladstein, from 1947 on, didn't Mr. Komodo talk with you again and again, begging you to pay attention to your union duties? Kawano, I believe Mr. Komodo talked to me about 2 or 3 times. Gladstein, in 1947, didn't the executive board of your union have to write to you and ask you to come and attend meetings? Kawano, correct. That was because I had other duties. At that time, I was also president of the Territorial Council of the ILWU, and I had been working on assignments sometimes on this island and sometimes on the outside islands. The assignments on this island sometimes included the legislature. In 1949, I was the legislative representative for the territorial group in the legislature. Gladstein, did you ever tell that to the Longshore local? Kawano, I did. They knew where I was. Gladstein, they knew you were shooting pool. Kawano, I shot pool once in a while. Gladstein, they knew you were playing golf instead of taking care of their grievances. Kawano, I played golf once in a while. I shot pool once in a while, and once in a while, I played poker, just like Jack Hall. Footnote, Smith Act transcript, pp. 7197-7201. However, the earlier part of the exchanges judged the last comment of Kawano's about Hall must be interpreted as a cheap shot. Hall had a reputation among friends and enemies alike as a monumentally hard worker. In the author's March 13, 1975 interview with David Thompson and his March 21, 1975 interview with Robert McElrath, both ILWU officials had stories to tell about Kawano's progressive negligence in the performance of his union duties. McElrath offered as an example an occasion when Jack Kawano allowed a union contract to automatically renew itself at a time when it could and should have been reopened. Kawano was also reported as having put a slot machine in his office. Footnote end. Under relentless pressure from Gladstein, Kawano admitted having said on several occasions that he deeply hated Jack Hall. Kawano was quick to explain that this hatred stemmed entirely from Hall's membership in the Communist Party. The net effect of Kawano's testimony is mixed. There is no doubt that there was a basis in truth for much of what he said, but the way in which he colored his testimony is difficult to evaluate with precision. There is no doubt that he was at least partially motivated by vindictiveness towards Hall and the ILWU. In speaking with some individuals who were at the trial, the author has concluded that those who were predisposed to believe Kawano believed him. Those who were predisposed not to believe him did not. Few were on the fence. There were 3 more prosecution witnesses about whom a few words must be said: Paul Crouch, Daisy Van Dorn, and John Lautner. Paul Crouch was a minister's son from North Carolina who had drifted away from his home at the age of 21, coming to Hawaii in 1924. Having been converted from the Baptist to the communist faith, Crouch got himself in trouble for preaching Marxism to his Schofield Barracks buddies. For his political activities, Crouch was court-martialed and sentenced to a 3-year term at Alcatraz. Freed in 1928, Paul Crouch went to work for the Communist Party, remaining on the party's payroll until 1942. As an expert witness, Crouch was allowed to go on at great length about his own personal experiences in the Communist Party, although he had been out of the party for 3 years before the alleged conspiracy of the Hawaii 7 began. Probably the most colorful part of Crouch's testimony was his description of his visit to the Soviet Union shortly after he was released from Alcatraz. I participated in meetings of the executive committees of the Communist and Young Communist Internationals, the World Congress of the Red International Trade Unions. I met with members of the General Staff of the Red Army, reported to them and received directives from them. I received a commission as an honorary regimental commander in the Red Army. I met with leaders of the Soviet government and the Communist International, including Lenin's widow, Krupskaya, V.M. Molotov, Sen Keiichiyama of Japan, Harry Pollitt of Great Britain, and many other leaders. I spoke over the Comintern radio station. I received a commission of 5 members to draw up a documentary program for infiltration of capitalist armies and methods for communist activities during the future war. Such evidence was objected to again and again throughout Crouch's testimony, but Judge Wig invariably held that such testimony gave an insight into the workings of the Communist Party and was, therefore, relevant and binding upon the defendants. The same was true with the literature which was read into the record. Crouch, as an expert witness, had every opportunity to demonstrate his knowledge of communist literature, and after he had introduced a work which had, for example, been used in one of the Communist Party schools in which he had taught, the prosecution would then read copious amounts of the volume in question into the record. This was done so often that the mere announcement that the prosecutor was going to read would have the immediate effect of emptying the courtroom of spectators. A joke making the rounds went as follows. Prosecutor, have you ever seen a coconut tree? Witness, yes. Prosecutor, where? Witness, in front of the public library. Prosecutor, good. I shall now read to the jury the history of the Russian Revolution. Footnote, ILWU, Running Story, February 5, 1953, p.m., page 1. Running Story was a twice-a-day report of the Smith Act trial put out by the ILWU. Robert McElrath, in 1975, called it pure propaganda. The ILWU library has a more objective summary of the trial which was maintained by Theodora Krebs for the Union. It will be quite valuable for the scholar who eventually writes the full account of Hawaii's Smith Act trial. Footnote end. There was no effort made to show that Paul Crouch's brief adventure in Hawaii in 1924 had put him into contact with any of the defendants. There was testimony, however, to the effect that he had taught Jim Freeman in a Communist Party school in Olinda County in California just before World War II. Crouch was used as the government's first witness, and there can be no doubt that his testimony had a strong cumulative effect upon the jury despite the fact that the defense attorneys sought to show its contradictions and general irrelevancy. Daisy Van Dorn's testimony can only be called outrageous. When describing her own Communist Party training in San Francisco, Bloody Daisy, as she came to be called, grew very excited. The erratic grandmother offered the following scenario for the coming revolution. We were instructed that we were to go as far as cutting the telephone lines of our neighbors. Also, we were taught that we were immediately broken down to smaller classes, clubs, groups, as it were, and we were to have each club 8 guards. We were to take all our orders from them when the revolution broke, which would not be long, and they promised us in this class that they had food stored up for us for the time of the revolution. I was supposed to be the nurse in one of the houses, and I was to assist and take care and bandage up only members of the party. When Rord K. Roddick tried to break in on Daisy's testimony, she was quite angry, telling Roddick, "I'm not through yet." And indeed, she wasn't. Speaking of her instructor, Anne Polinchek, Daisy uttered the lines that were the source of her well-earned nickname. She said, "Now, there will be lots of blood running in the streets. It will be bloodthirsty, but we will gain our victory of socialistic government." Defense counsel sought to have a mistrial declared, so inflammatory was the testimony of Bloody Daisy. But Hoddick managed to swallow hard and say, "We will submit now that so far as the evidence of Anne Polinchek, it is material and relevant only as it goes to the nature and purpose of the Communist Party. In this connection, upon showing that these defendants in this court knew the aims and nature of the conspiracy, we submit that this evidence of Anne Polinchek's teachings and instructions would properly be binding against these defendants." 54. Judge John Wig found Hoddick's argument reasonable and denied the motion without comment. If Crouch and Van Dorn were flamboyant, the last of the government's imports from the mainland was not. John Lautner was the government's chief witness in every Smith Act case after the Dennis case in 1949. John Lautner was a Communist Party wheelhorse from 1932 to 1950, when he was unceremoniously expelled from the party. Herbert L. Packer, in his volume, Ex-Communist Witness, chose Lautner as one of his 4 representative subjects. In his conclusion, Packer says the following about Lautner. John Lautner's workmanlike role in the communist movement is echoed in his stolid, pedantic, relatively unshakable testimony. To be sure, he has been tripped up on more than one occasion. He has also been evasive, militantly self-justifying, and all the other things one might expect of a man who, late in life, finds himself in the unenviable position of repudiating his life's work. Yet he gives the overall impression of close familiarity with the party's ideology and, more important, with the day-to-day details of its operation. Strongly in Lautner's favor as a witness is the fact that he has not carved out an extra testimonial career as an ex-communist. He has been paid, and paid well, for his testimony, but he has not had the additional impetus to fabricate that comes from the creation of a public image that must constantly be refurbished by yet another round of revelations. 55. Howard K. Hoddick told the author, in 1975, that John Lautner was the government's most satisfactory witness. He was surely their most heavily used witness. His testimony covers 2,239 pages of the transcript. Lautner was the expert on the aims and purposes of the Communist Party, and his testimony epitomizes what the author referred to earlier as the literary aspects of the Smith Act trial. For a full month Lautner sat on the stand competently working at his job as a professional ex-communist. His employers were pleased, defense counsel was exasperated, and the public was generally bored. The defense and its rebuttal will not be discussed here beyond saying that it was not responsive to the case the government had attempted to make. None of the witnesses appeared in his own behalf. What happened, instead, was a parade of character witnesses. 50 witnesses appeared in behalf of one or more of the defendants, followed by a parade of prosecution witnesses, stating that the character of the defendants was bad. 21 such witnesses were produced to the government. But the example of the Dennis decision which defined the law in this case, and the seemingly unquestionable fact that all 7 defendants were, at some time during the alleged conspiracy, April 1, 1945 to August 28, 1951, members of the Communist Party, combined to produce an almost inevitable decision. The Hawaii 7 were convicted on June 19, 1953, after the jury had deliberated for 16 hours. The 6 men were sentenced to 5 years in jail and fined $5,000. Eileen Fujimoto was sentenced to 3 years in jail and fined $2,000. At the request of the government, bail was raised to $15,000 while the appeal of the decision worked its way through the courts. The ILWU Defense Fund was able to get Jack Hall released immediately, but the others had to spend a week in jail while bail was being arranged. None of them ever returned to jail. On June 17, 1957, almost exactly 4 years after the verdict in the Hawaii Smith Act trial, the United States Supreme Court made the decision which led to the reversal of the conviction of the Hawaii 7. In Yates v. United States, the conviction of 14 convicted leaders of the Communist Party in California was overturned. Justice John Marshall Harlan considered the Yates case from several viewpoints. His first ruling was statutory rather than constitutional, and had to do with the term organize. The government had argued that the term organize connotes a continuing process and was not, therefore, subject to a 3-year statute of limitations. Justice Harlan and the majority of the court held that the statute of limitations did apply, thereby overturning the convictions. On the constitutional question, there is no doubt that Harlan, his own protestations to the contrary notwithstanding, led the Supreme Court back to a position more closely in tune with Holmes' clear and present danger doctrine. We are faced with the question whether the Smith Act prohibits advocacy and teaching of forcible overthrow as an abstract principle, divorced from any effort to instigate action to that end, so long as such advocacy or teaching is engaged in with evil intent. We hold that it does not. On January 20, 1958, the Hawaii 7 became the beneficiaries of the Yates decision. 8 1/2 years after their original arrest, their legal ordeal had finally ended.